In 1933, Boeing built the most advanced commercial aircraft the world had ever seen. It was faster than anything flying. It was smoother, quieter, more modern in every way that mattered. It made the Ford Trimotor, the aircraft that had defined American commercial aviation for nearly a decade, look like a relic from another era. And then something unexpected happened. The airlines that couldn't get the Boeing 247 because Boeing had given all of them to United went to Douglas and asked for something better. And Douglas built something better. The Boeing 247 didn't just defeat the Ford Trimotor, it accidentally wrote the specification for the aircraft that would defeat itself. This is that story. To understand the chain of events that produced the DC-3, you have to start where commercial aviation itself started. Not with glamour or romance, but with the unglamorous, uncomfortable, financially precarious reality of trying to build a business around carrying people through the sky in the 1920s. The decade that followed the First World War was aviation's adolescence, full of energy and ambition and genuine technical progress, but also deeply uncertain about what commercial flight was actually going to become. The airmail routes that the U.S. government had established gave early airlines a financial foundation, but passenger revenue was thin and unreliable. The aircraft available for passenger service were, by any honest assessment, not particularly well suited to persuading the traveling public that flying was preferable to the train. Into this world came Henry Ford. The man who had built the automobile into something ordinary Americans could own and depend on turned his attention to aviation in the mid-1920s with the same combination of manufacturing ambition and mass-market instinct that had made the Model T transformative. The Ford Trimotor, the aircraft that emerged from Ford's aviation operation, was not a sophisticated design by the standards of what aeronautical engineering could theoretically produce. It was corrugated metal, 3 engines, fixed undercarriage, and a cabin that subjected passengers to noise and vibration that would be considered unacceptable by any subsequent standard. But it was reliable, it was produced in numbers, and it carried the Ford name, which in 1926 meant something significant about trustworthiness and American manufacturing competence. The Trimotor became the backbone of early American commercial aviation, not because it was wonderful, but because it was available, dependable, and backed by a name that gave nervous passengers some measure of reassurance. Airlines like United, TWA, American, and a growing constellation of smaller carriers built their early operations around it. Pilots learned to fly it. Mechanics learned to maintain it, and passengers learned to endure it. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't fast, but it worked, and in the early years of commercial aviation, working was enough. But the world was changing around the Trimotor even as airlines were building their businesses on it. Aeronautical engineering was advancing rapidly through the late 1920s and into the early 1930s. The technology of all-metal monocoque construction, where the skin of the aircraft carries structural load rather than an internal framework, was maturing. Variable pitch propellers were improving efficiency. Retractable undercarriages were moving from experimental to practical. The ingredients for a genuinely modern commercial aircraft were becoming available, and the question was which manufacturer would assemble them first into something the airlines could actually use. The answer came from Seattle, from a company whose commercial aviation ambitions had been overshadowed by its military work, but whose engineering talent was considerable and whose competitive instincts were sharp. Boeing had been watching the commercial market develop with the particular attention of a company that understood the technology well enough to know what was possible and was waiting for the moment when the market was ready to absorb it. By the early 1930s, that moment had arrived, and Boeing's response to it was the aircraft that changed everything, not once, but twice, in ways that Boeing only half intended. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming. The Boeing 247 was different from the Ford Trimotor the way a sports car is different from a farm truck. Both have 4 wheels and an engine. The comparison ends there. Where the Trimotor was corrugated aluminum, a construction method that was structurally straightforward but aerodynamically compromised, the corrugations creating drag that limited speed, the 247 was smooth. Its all-metal monocoque fuselage was sleek in a way that made the Trimotor look not just older, but philosophically different, belonging to a different understanding of what an aircraft could be. Passengers who had flown on Trimotors and then boarded a 247 described the visual contrast alone as striking, the sense of stepping from something industrial into something that aspired to elegance. The undercarriage retracted. This sounds like a small thing, and was, in terms of passenger experience, largely invisible, but it was aerodynamically significant. Eliminating the fixed undercarriage's drag allowed the 247 to cruise at speeds that made the Trimotor's performance look almost stationary by comparison. The 247 could cross the continental United States in under 20 hours, a time that had previously required stopping more frequently and spending longer at each leg. The compression of distance that the 247's speed produced was genuinely meaningful to the business travelers who were aviation's most important customers. The cabin was pressurized adequately and heated properly. The noise, while still significant by any subsequent standard, was meaningfully reduced from the Trimotor's assault on the ears. Passengers could hold a conversation without shouting. They arrived at their destinations less physically depleted than Trimotor travel typically left them. The 247 wasn't comfortable in any absolute sense. It was still a small, relatively noisy aircraft operated in an era before the refinements that would come to define passenger expectations, but it was comfortable relative to what had come before in a way that the airlines understood immediately as commercially significant. The two Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines were more powerful and more reliable than the Trimotor's 3 engines, an important psychological point as much as a technical one. The Trimotor's 3 engines had always carried the implication that one of them might fail and the other two would keep you airborne. The 247's two more powerful and more reliable engines didn't need that insurance in the same way. Pilots who flew the 247 described it as an aircraft that felt purposeful in a way that the Trimotor, for all its dependability, never quite managed. It felt like it was going somewhere deliberately rather than getting there through persistence. But here is where the story takes its ironic turn, because the 247, for all its genuine brilliance, had a flaw that its designers hadn't fully appreciated, and that its commercial strategy made catastrophic. The cabin was too small. Not dramatically too small, not obviously too small in the way that a fatal design error is obviously fatal, but small enough that the economics of operating it were constrained in ways that would matter enormously once a competitor appeared with a more generous answer to the same question. The 247 carried 10 passengers. Douglas, when TWA came to them asking for something better, would build the DC-2 to carry 14, and then the DC-3 to carry 21. Each of those steps forward in capacity was a step backward for the 247's commercial viability, and Boeing couldn't respond because they had made another decision that at the time seemed like brilliant strategy and proved to be something else entirely. They had given all 60 of the first production 247s to United Airlines, exclusively, before any other airline could order one. United was part of the same corporate family as Boeing at the time, and the arrangement made a certain internal logic: secure a major launch customer, establish the aircraft in service on the most important routes, build the operational track record that would drive subsequent orders. What the arrangement actually did was hand every other major American airline a powerful and immediate incentive to find a better aircraft as quickly as possible. TWA, American, and the others couldn't get a 247 on any timeline that mattered, so they went to Douglas. And Douglas, with the competitive pressure of a genuine market need and the technical brief of operators who knew exactly what they wanted, built something that the 247 couldn't match. The human experience of the Boeing 247 era is a story told from several different positions simultaneously, and the position you occupy determines whether you experience the 24/7 as triumph or as provocation. For United Airlines pilots, the 24/7 was a revelation. These were men who had built their flying careers on aircraft that communicated their limitations constantly and clearly, aircraft that vibrated and strained and made you aware throughout every flight of the effort involved in staying airborne. The 24/7 flew with a smoothness and a confidence that felt qualitatively different. Several United veterans from that era described their first flights in the 24/7 as the moment they understood what modern aviation could become. Not what it was, but what the trajectory pointed toward. The aircraft gave them a glimpse of a future that its own short commercial life would not survive long enough to fully inhabit. First-time flyers who had heard stories about the noise and vibration of propeller travel were surprised on the 24/7 to find the experience more manageable than they had feared. Regular travelers who knew the Trimotor well were struck by how much better the 24/7 was. Not perfect, not comfortable in any absolute sense, but measurably, noticeably better in ways that matter to them. The executives and pilots at TWA, American, and the other airlines locked out of the 24/7, the aircraft's appearance on United's routes was something different entirely. It was a competitive threat of the most concrete kind, a rival carrier demonstrably operating superior equipment on shared routes, attracting passengers who could see and feel the difference. The urgency this created was real and immediate. These were not people with the luxury of waiting for Boeing to make the 24/7 available to them. They needed a response now, and the response they sought from Douglas was shaped by everything they had observed about what the 24/7 did well and what it left undone. Jack Fry at TWA is the human figure whose initiative most directly connects the 24/7's competitive threat to the DC-3's creation. His letter to Douglas and to other manufacturers laying out the specifications for the aircraft TWA needed was specific in ways that reflected careful observation of what the 24/7 had established as possible and deliberate ambition about what the next step beyond it should deliver. More passengers, more range, better performance from the airports TWA needed to serve. The brief that produced the DC-2 and ultimately the DC-3 was written by someone who had studied the 24/7 carefully and decided that its limitations were as instructive as its achievements. The Douglas engineers who received that brief were in the position that produces the best engineering. Given a clear problem, adequate resources, genuine competitive urgency, and the benefit of observing what the previous best answer had gotten right and wrong. The DC-2 they produced answered the brief directly. The DC-3 that followed, refined from operational experience with the DC-2, answered it so completely that the question of what commercial aviation's primary aircraft should be was effectively settled for the next 2 decades. The mechanics who worked on the 24/7 in United's maintenance operations describe an aircraft that was genuinely advanced for its time, but that carried the specific limitations of being first. First-generation problems, systems that worked but could have been laid out more accessibly, design choices that reflected what engineering could produce rather than what maintenance experience would eventually demand. The 24/7 was well built. It was not built with the benefit of the operational feedback that the DC-3 incorporated, because the DC-3 had the advantage of learning from everything that came before it. The conflict at the heart of the Boeing 247 story is one of the most instructive in commercial aviation history because it was entirely self-inflicted. Boeing had the technology, Boeing had the manufacturing capability, Boeing had the relationships with the airlines that would eventually buy hundreds of DC-3s from Douglas. What Boeing lacked was the willingness to make that technology available to the market on terms that the market could accept, and the exclusive arrangement with United, which seemed like strategic brilliance in 1932, proved to be the decision that handed Douglas everything it needed. When the DC-2 entered service with TWA, the 247's competitive advantage began to erode immediately. The DC-2 was faster, carried more passengers, and had longer range. When American Airlines pushed Douglas to develop the DC-3 for sleeper service, the erosion became a rout. The DC-3 was so much better than the 247 in every economically relevant category that airlines outside the United system had no reason to consider the Boeing product at all. And United, despite its head start, found that the 247's capacity limitations made it increasingly difficult to compete on routes where the DC-3's economics were simply more compelling. Boeing attempted to respond. A more powerful variant of the 247 was developed and offered to the market. It found limited interest. The window that the 247's own exclusive arrangement had opened for Douglas had been used so effectively that Boeing's response arrived too late to matter. The 247 remained in United service through the late 1930s and served in various military and utility roles through the war years. But its moment as the defining commercial aircraft had passed almost as quickly as it had arrived, ended not by a flaw in the aircraft itself, but by a business decision that had created the conditions for its own obsolescence. The Boeing 247's legacy is inseparable from the DC-3's legacy, because without the 247, there is no DC-3.
And without the DC-3, commercial aviation's economic foundation might have taken years longer to establish. The 247 proved that modern commercial aviation was technically possible, that all-metal construction, retractable undercarriage, and reliable twin-engine power could produce an aircraft that genuinely served passengers, rather than merely enduring them. That proof was necessary. Without it, the brief that TWA sent to Douglas would have been written differently, would have aimed lower, would have been constrained by a more limited understanding of what was achievable. The 247 also proved through the consequences of its exclusive arrangement with United that the commercial aviation market would not tolerate the concentration of advantage in the hands of a single carrier, that the competitive dynamics of the industry would drive innovation faster than any single manufacturer could control. That lesson echoed forward through decades of aviation competition, shaping how manufacturers thought about launch customer relationships and exclusive arrangements in ways that are still visible in how commercial aircraft programs are structured today. The Ford Trimotor, which the 247 had made obsolete, is remembered today with the particular affection that people reserve for things that were good enough for their moment, genuinely capable within the limits of what their moment required, and honest about those limits in a way that made their replacement feel like progress rather than repudiation. The 247 is remembered differently, as the aircraft that was too good for its own good, that created the conditions for its own surpassing by being right about everything except the business decision that surrounded it.
We began with a chain. The Ford Trimotor established commercial aviation's first real infrastructure. The Boeing 247 made it obsolete in a stroke and proved that modern aviation was possible. And then, through a business decision that was strategically logical and competitively catastrophic, the 247 handed Douglas the motivation and the brief that produced the DC-3. 3 aircraft, 3 steps, each one necessary. Each one made possible by what came before it and made obsolete by what came after it. There is something worth sitting with in that chain. The Boeing 247 was not a failure. It was, by any technical measure, a triumph, the most advanced commercial aircraft in the world at the moment of its introduction, the aircraft that ended the Ford Trimotor era and proved what modern aviation could be. The fact that it triggered the creation of something better than itself is not a mark against it. It is, in a strange way, the highest possible compliment. The 247 was good enough to raise the standard, and raising the standard in aviation, as in most things that matter, is how the next right answer gets written. The DC-3 was that answer, and it flew, as we know, for 90 years and counting. But it needed the 247 to show it what to exceed, and it needed the Ford Trimotor, loud and corrugated and magnificently inadequate, to show the 247 what to replace. Progress, it turns out, is always standing on something. By the way, if you like stories like this, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there's a lot more coming.